In this podcast, two Gen Xers are taking a trip down memory lane, revisiting and reflecting on the cinema of the 1980s. We'll look at the hits and the flops, the studio blockbusters and art house indies, the critically acclaimed, and the universally reviled. The series is hosted by me, Lisa Molinelli, a writer and librarian, and features Dustin Morrow, a filmmaker, author, and professor of film. So pull on your legwarmers, crank up your boombox, and hop in the DeLorean. It's time for the Long Rewind. Welcome to the Long Rewind. I'm your host, Lisa. With me, as always, is Dustin.
Hey, everybody.
And today we are talking about the best performances of the 80s. And Acting, yes, which is very exciting.
John Lovitz on SNL.
On SNL.
Was it Master Thespian? Was that the name of that
I think so.
character?
That sounds right.
Acting.
It's great. So we're going to be talking about acting in the 80s, essentially.
Yeah.
And I love this. I think it's going to be really fun. But I often struggle to assess a performance, like to actually tell someone why I think a performance is good or not. Like, I think I can, I have maybe an inherent sense that I'm watching a good performance, but, I don't necessarily have the vocabulary to talk about it. So maybe, you have studied this a lot and thought about it a lot. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about how you assess a performance.
You want to plug my book?
Oh, yes. Well, let's plug your book. First of all, tell the good folks about your book.
Why didn't you plug the book, and then it won't sound like I'm shamelessly plugging
Well,
the book.
You have written a book with the iconic 80s actress Kathleen Turner. It's called Kathleen Turner on Acting, and it's basically a conversation between you and Kathleen Turner about how actors and directors work together, and the craft of acting, mostly in film, although I think maybe some on stage.
Some on stage and TV. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have a lot of thoughts and a lot of experience thinking about this.
And I thought I knew, as somebody who's been directing movies for 25 years plus, I thought I kind of knew what there was to know about actors and working with actors before I wrote that book. And then through the, years-long marathon process of writing that book with Kathleen, learned that, there was a lot I didn't know.
Yeah. But that's all,
It was just interesting working with her and finding out because she's somebody that doesn't subscribe to a specific school of acting.
Yeah.
She's not all Stanislavski and so she comes to it with a kind of her own method, which is very practical and very unfussy.
Yes.
And I found that was, speaking to her as somebody who's kind of created her own personal one-person school of thought about it, was really interesting because I didn't have the foothold that I had from having some basic knowledge of the classical approaches to acting, which have informed in the past how I work with actors. Because once I understand, this is an actor that, is improv-y and likes to do 20 takes and is pretty free with the text, and when you can get a sense of that pretty quickly, you can understand how to then work with that person. But it's a little tougher when they have their own MO.
Yeah. Well, and I should say that's another qualification you have for this is you do work with actors all the time when you direct films. So it's just something you think a lot about. It
didn't used to be, but it's kind of become over the years my favorite aspect of directing is working with actors to craft performances.
Yeah.
And I've heard from many directors. I met John Waters once and asked him what single piece of advice he would give to a young director, which is what I was at the time when I met him a long time ago. And he said, just cast it well. He said, if you do that, that will make you look so good and you really don't have to do anything. He said that's 90% of your job is to cast your parts well.
Yeah.
So it's a little scary to think about that in a way because it's something you're doing even before you start shooting, and yet it's if you believe him, is responsible for 90% of the success of your movie, and it's a decision that you're making before you even step on the set.
Yeah.
But I've come to learn that it is like that important. I mean, the actors are the window into the movie for our audience. It's funny, when I give lectures on acting at like libraries and stuff like that, I show this clip from Iron Man 2. This is not a movie you would expect to see in a lecture on acting in film.
Yeah.
But the reason I show it is that there was this film festival many years ago, like around the time that movie came out in Italy, and the director of that movie, Jon Favreau, was there. And they did an interesting experiment where they showed the movie with eye tracking devices on the audience's eyes. So devices that could measure to the millimeter where the audience was looking on the screen at any given moment. And what they found was really interesting, which is that almost the entire audience was looking at the exact same place within the frame at the same time, like constantly. And the place they were looking was at the faces of the actors.
Yeah.
And so even in the big action scene, like cars exploding and Iron Man flying around and, guns firing and people flying every which way, even when all that stuff was going on, the place in the frame that the audience's eyes were always drawn was to the faces of the actors.
Yeah.
And Favreau's response was something like, well, geez, I'm so glad I spent $200 million on all these effects if people are going to be looking at the actors. But I think it's indicative of how important the performances of the actors are.
Yeah. We're social creatures, and it just keeps getting proven over and over and over again, no matter what the media is.
Yeah. So I've diverged. Your question of like, how do I tell what's a good performance?
So how do you tell?
On I'll go a little deeper, but on a simple level, I think it's do you believe it? But that's not enough, because I think a lot of actors can give believable performances that still don't really grab you or compel you. And so my second kind of rule would be, or question would be, is it compelling? Is it believable, and is it compelling? And those are the most important things. And that's, I think, what separates film acting from other venues of acting. Like most obvious one would be the stage, that theater actors very often don't make good film actors, because it's almost a completely different art. And it's interesting that so many acting programs in colleges and universities are entirely theater focused, but then so many of their graduates go on to pursue careers or try to earn the majority of their living through film and television and commercials and stuff.
Right, that's how you do it.
Without ever having studied how to interact with a camera, which is a completely different art form than projecting small or subtle emotions to huge audiences of people in a giant room. Well, and I guess like a theater.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm hearing is the difference might be that a theater actor is probably going to be bigger in terms of the way they emote or project something than when you're on film. Your face is like huge.
Yeah. Well, my experience as a director who often casts people with theater experience and maybe little film experience is that the first thing you have to do with them is bring them down, because and it's not that they're bad actors. It's part of it is that they're used to projecting to the back of the room. They have to make the people in the back row see what their character is thinking and doing from, 200 feet away. And so, of course, their performance has to be outsized. When they get in front of a camera, the camera does 90% of that work for them.
Right.
The lens does that work for them by coming so much closer to them, and also by creating a record of their face and their expressions and their actions that is going to be quite large, whether that's on a 55-inch television or on a 200-foot screen, like shooting them in close up.
Yeah.
So maybe on a stage doing a monologue, you might never think of where you're going to take a breath or where you're going to blink, because who can see a blink even in the first row, let alone the last row of a theater? But in a close up in film, the camera sees every blink and every breath. And this is something I learned from Kathleen, that a lot of actors will plan like where they're going to blink in a line of dialogue because it makes a difference. It can change the meaning of the scene and how the audience interprets what the character is thinking and feeling.
Yeah. I mean, when I learned that, my mind was blown. Like that it's amazing how much thought, well, all actors, no matter what their craft, but the type of thought you have to put into a film performance is really fascinating.
It's a hard thing to wrap your head around as an audience, because it's so mysterious, because it's so internal. Like we can, even the most unschooled kind of film watcher can tell good cinematography generally. Like, does it look...
Or you might know this looks good, this looks bad.
Or,
even if you can't
they
say
might
why.
think like, I mean, I guess that's not exactly true, because good cinematography is not necessarily beautiful cinematography. It's cinematography that matches the tone and the narrative. But in general, like, they get it. Like, if it's cut too fast and they're starting to get a headache because the editing is too quick, they're like, okay, I get it. I'm getting a headache because this is like, I can't tell what's going on. But it's harder to understand what choices an actor is making and what they're doing, because it looks so effortless, and if you're thinking about it, you're outside the movie, because you're assessing the actor and you're not going on the journey with the character.
Right. And maybe that's why it's so hard for me to make those assessments, and maybe that's a good thing. It means that I'm seeing a lot of good performances, perhaps, when, if I've been taken along on the journey, I'm not even thinking about what a great performance this is.
So I'll tell you before we get into this how I assess acting then. And a lot of this work is actually work that I do more as an editor than as a director. Because when you're an editor, you have to assemble an actor's performance. And to do that, you might be pulling bits from like one take, and then a little bit like a look from another take, and a line of dialogue from a third take, and another line of dialogue from a fourth take. And you're kind of building their performance from a bunch of different takes.
So you're usually not even, it's not all
angles.
one take usually.
Sometimes. It just depends.
Yeah, right.
But often no. And so when you're doing that, you have to look at what you can't be going entirely on gut, although that's part of it. You have to look at certain things. So here's what I'm looking at.
Okay.
I'm looking at, as I said, their eyes. It's important to see them, by the way, because even within the face, they found in eye tracking exercises on audiences that people are looking at the eyes, not the face.
Right, specifically.
Which is why cinematographers have what are called eye lights, where they're lights that are especially, they're tiny, they look like little flashlights, and they just shine them right on the actor's eyes, because the worst thing you could do as a DP, as a cinematographer, is lose the actor's eyes in shadow.
Right.
Because when you do that, it's been shown that breaks the bond between the audience and the character.
Wow.
It's also why when you watch animation, the character's eyes are always the largest and most expressive part of any animated character's face.
Huh. Right? Yeah, that's fascinating. Wow.
So I'm looking at their eyes and what they're doing with their eyes. I'm listening to their voice. Okay. I'm listening for their pitch, the rhythm, the timbre of their voice, the speed at which they're delivering dialogue. I'm looking at their body language, what they're doing with their arms and their stance. I mean, all of this is stuff that you could learn by studying psychology. I'm sure there've been a million psych experiments studying things like voice and certainly body language, like mirroring. Those kinds of things are all things that would benefit actors and like budding directors. Like, I have students sometimes that come to me and they ask me, like, what should I be taking for my electives outside of the film program to finish my degree? And I always say writing. They should go study writing, creative writing. But, if they want to be directors, then studying psychology is not the worst thing you could do.
Yeah, makes sense.
So I'm looking at the size of the performance. That's that question of how broad is it?
Right.
And broad doesn't necessarily equal bad.
Sure.
If it matches
the tone of the movie, of course. Yeah.
You're not going to give the same size of performance in Airplane that you're going to give in Schindler's List.
Of course. Yeah, it really is.
I'm looking at the tone, and by tone I mean, is their performance somehow demonstrate an awareness of the genre and the type of movie they're in?
Okay.
So with Kathleen, the examples of that come immediately to mind are Body Heat.
Okay.
Because that's a film noir.
Yes.
And so much of her dialogue, what's her famous line? You're not that smart, are you? I like that in a man.
Very hard-boiled kind of.
Like that line of dialogue delivered in a way that is sort of like, what's the word? Like believable or is completely sincere is going to come off really corny and really strange because it's so stylized.
Okay.
And so the actor has to attune their performance to, like, you're going to give a certain kind of performance in a film noir, and it's not going to be the same performance you give in like a soap opera or a comedy or whatever.
Yeah.
Another good example from her career would be Serial Mom. Mm-hmm. Any actor, I think, that's working with John Waters has to calibrate their performance in some way to fit what he's doing with his movie.
Of course.
Because his movies are so unique and so different.
They have
from everybody.
an aesthetic and a tone.
It's not even, you can't even go in and give kind of like a standard comedic performance.
Because
that doesn't work.
That makes sense.
It's got to be like a blend of sort of tongue in cheek, but also like weirdly sincere in spite of its ugliness. They're strange, his movies, and they require in some ways strange performances. If you look at what Kathleen does in Serial Mom, she's almost playing it's like a demented version of Donna Reed or Barbara Billingsley, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And then the last thing I'm looking at is what they're doing excuse me, my phone's going off. When they're not delivering dialogue.
Okay.
So, acting teachers in like first year acting classes will say like acting is reacting. You might have even heard that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard that before.
So it's like, how do they listen?
Right.
What are they
important? Yeah.
What are they, what are they doing? Because especially as an editor, a lot of the best material for demonstrating what a character is thinking is in those moments when the character is not speaking.
Mm-hmm. We're back to psychology again in a way. Yeah.
So anyway, let's get to the 80s.
Yeah.
I just sat down and I was like, I'm going to make a list of my favorite performances or what I think are the best performances of the decade.
Yeah.
And I looked at what the Oscars said, and I find that I don't often agree with the Oscars, although sometimes I do. I think only one of my top 10 won an Oscar.
Oh, wow. Okay.
For acting. But I think I was thinking also just about what makes a good film actor. Mm-hmm. And it isn't the same thing as what makes a good actor, because again, a good film actor has a relationship with the camera. It's sort of like, I don't know, like that magic.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard this talked about that it factor. They have to read well on camera, and not every good actor does, unfortunately. Yeah.
And I think also a lot of it is just opportunity. Certain actors get offered kinds of, like, De Niro is considered one of our best actors, and it's not that he hasn't earned the parts he got, but look at what he was offered to do. Right. I mean, there are actors that every once in a while, there's a story about like an actor who'll come out and do something like Adam Sandler in Uncut Gems, right?
Yeah.
And people will go, oh my God, like he's a good actor. Like we didn't know. Like it was some kind of crazy. And it's like, well, of course he is. Like he just does, he just does these terrible comedies over and over again.
So yes, to some degree, it's the material.
But he obviously can work with a camera. Like he knows how to interact with a camera.
Yeah.
Which is always that's the dance. It's like the dance between the actor and the kind of invisible audience that's floating behind the camera.
Yeah, I do. I remember, from reading your book and talking to Kathleen, that there really is such awareness of where the camera is and calibrating your performance to where the camera is. And that also blew my mind. Again, just the thought you have to put into that is incredible.
I was asking her, I was like, I remember asking her, like, who does she think the best actors are? And she, of course, wasn't really going to name names, but she did say, I've never forgot this. She said, a lot of the best actors I've ever seen, you'll never see in a movie because they'll blow you away on stage, and then you put them in front of a camera, and it's like they disappear.
Oh, yeah.
So there's something about, film, as I said, film acting is its own thing. So I made this list, and I broke these up into categories, and I think that's a good place to start, which is a category that I would call like star power.
Okay.
Which is a category where I think where like they just hit the lottery in terms of putting the right actor in the right part.
Casting, like you said before.
Yeah, because that actor, you have a part where an actor just was seemingly born for a part, and there's no other actor who could have done what they did as well as they did with that part. And it's not necessarily because they're some great thespian, but just because you happen to like catch lightning in a bottle in terms of casting.
Right.
So for me, that's like Eddie Murphy in Beverly Hills Cop.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I don't think most people, when sitting down to make a list of the greatest performances of the 80s, are going to put something like Eddie Murphy or a movie like Beverly Hills Cop on the list. But for me, like, that he is that movie.
He's delightful. I mean, he is, absolutely. He's that movie. He's
like
Axel F.
explodes off the screen.
100%. Yeah.
Hackman in Hoosiers is kind of like the absolute picture of the stand-up coach and the kind of the moral compass of the Midwest.
Sort of an archetype there. Yeah.
Michelle Pfeiffer in Into the Night.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think is, you and I have talked about that movie on this podcast. It's one of our favorite, I think, overlooked movies of the 80s. And it's sort of like, for me, it's like ground zero of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, but it's elevated beyond that even.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know you love her in that movie too.
Yeah, well, she's luminous, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can see why she would drag people along with her on a crazy quest, which is kind of what happens. So yeah.
Michael Douglas in Wall Street.
Yeah.
Michael Douglas was, for many people in the 80s, kind of like the ultimate privileged yuppie, upper middle class privileged white guy.
He seemed like the quintessential image of that. I mean, maybe not in real life.
And it comes to a head a few years later in a movie called Falling Down.
Oh, yeah.
But Wall Street was kind of like the pinnacle of that. But you can see it in like Fatal Attraction and a lot of his other works. And even his later works like Disclosure. And, but, he was there was really nobody better to play that kind of like Titan of Wall Street with, who has no moral compass, kind of the flip side of what Gene Hackman was doing in Hoosiers. Robin Williams in Dead Poets Society, which I think is another kind of culmination of like what made him great, which was he could be really funny and really broad. And you saw that in like Good Morning Vietnam. He could also obviously do drama. He won an Oscar a few years later for Good Will Hunting.
Right.
But he was so empathetic and sensitive.
Yeah. Beyond
being really funny. And you really saw that I think, come to a head in that movie. He's like the teacher everybody would want
to be. Yeah.
And then I would also include in this category both Dudley Moore and Liza Minnelli in Arthur.
Oh, yeah. Love them.
Just one of the great romantic comedies of the 80s. And this is a side thing, but nobody played inebriated better than Dudley Moore did.
Yeah.
I think the secret to playing drunk is trying to seem like you're not drunk, which is what drunk people do when they're drunk.
Yeah.
And he got that. And most actors will kind of like do bits almost in a way when they're playing drunk, or like they're stumbling all over the place.
Right.
And when you see him in that movie, you can see his brain constantly working to not bump into things and to not make a fool of himself. And
I mean, talk about believable. He's definitely believable and compelling.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And Liza is essentially playing Liza in that movie.
Right.
And but again, that's part of casting and understanding what does a part need, Mm-hmm. And then the last one I had in this category was Matthew Broderick as Ferris Bueller.
Oh yeah.
I don't know who.
Yeah, like who else would be Ferris?
Maybe John Cryer could have done it, but I don't think he's as charming as Matthew Broderick in that part. So I don't know.
Again, I think Matthew Broderick, like Michelle Pfeiffer in Into the Night, like you're like, of course people would go along with this guy's crazy schemes.
Yeah.
Of course.
It's an incredible feat when you think about it, because if you really look at it, Ferris Bueller is kind of a jerk.
I know.
Right?
You realize this as you get older.
I've read pieces that are like, is Ferris Bueller a sociopath? Like, he might be. But Matthew Broderick and to be fair, like in partnership with John Hughes, really make the character the opposite of that.
Yeah, I mean, he really charms you, charms the heck out of you. It's true. It's one of those things you realize when you get older that you're like, oh, Ferris is kind of awful. Yeah. But yeah.
So one thing an Oscars love is when actors play folks who are differently abled. And they love people who wear a lot of makeup, old age makeup.
Right, prosthetic type things.
What I would call and so I had this kind of little category of what I would call acting like through the stuff that is kind of put in front of a performance.
I see. Interesting. Okay.
So for me, that's Daniel Day-Lewis in My Left Foot. Mm-hmm. These are movies a famous example of this, which I think is actually not as successful, would be Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man.
Oh, okay.
Which, there's a thing where the actors will do where they think like, oh, I'm going to play this character that's, heavy set. So I'm just going to gain 200 pounds. Mm-hmm. And everybody goes, oh my God, they're so amazing. Mm-hmm. And, but I look at it sometimes and I think, well, are they, or did they just gain 200 pounds and they're just giving a mediocre performance after that? And so, like Daniel Day-Lewis to me transcends the limitations put on him by what that performance requires in a way that Hoffman doesn't in Rain Man.
Okay.
De Niro in Raging Bull, obviously one of the great performances of the 80s.
I don't think I realized
again, kind of transcending the physical limitation put on him, which is that he had to gain all this weight.
Oh, okay, right? Okay, yeah.
Eric Stoltz in Mask is incredible. He's wearing a ton of prosthetics.
Yes.
So much so that he can barely make expressions with his face through the prosthetics. And what he does with his voice in that movie is so tender and so lovely, and I think conveys everything from that character. Dustin Hoffman in Tootsie. Which be an interesting movie to see how it would be received today, if it could even be made today. But he's doing, that movie could easily have been all gimmick.
Oh yeah.
Right? And much broader than it was.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to shout out our girl Kathleen.
Yeah, of course.
In Peggy Sue Got Married, playing a woman in her 40s and a woman in her teens without any makeup in either case.
Yeah, this is sort of like the opposite,
makeup.
right?
She does the entire role through
physically,
body language, how she carries herself, and what she does with her voice.
This is a movie I have yet to see, but really, really need to see. I've heard how wonderful it is and how great she is in it.
Roger Ebert wrote an interesting essay on how Kathleen Turner uses her body in that movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's a very physical actor, and I believe she'll tell you that too. So yeah, it's really fun to see.
So speaking of transcending limitations on the acting, I've also got a category, put together a category that I think is called transcending the screenplay.
Oh.
And it's not to say that these are bad screenplays. In fact, I mostly think they're really good. It's just that these are not performances that on paper are going to lead anybody to win an Academy Award, for example. But I think these are all Academy Award quality performances.
I see. Okay.
So, for example, Alan Rickman in Die Hard.
Oh, yeah.
One of the great, they're on paper. If you just read the script, you would not see what he ended up doing with that part, the humor that he brought to that part.
Right. I see. So it could have just been a real cardboard villain, and he didn't do that. Is that? Yeah.
Mel Gibson in Lethal Weapon. I think a lot of people forget because there were so many Lethal Weapons, and they were so comedic.
Yes.
Past the first one. Not that the first one didn't have some levity, but not anywhere like parts 2, 3, and 4. They forget how dark the Martin Riggs character was in the original Lethal Weapon.
That's true. I'd forgotten.
How they forget, I think, that the gimmick in that movie, gimmick's not the right word, but the hook of that movie was that his character was completely suicidal.
Right.
And because of that, he was willing to take risks in his job that made him a better cop than other cops.
Right. He had no fear, kind of.
Yeah, he had no fear of dying, essentially, because he wanted to die.
Yeah.
He had a death wish.
Isn't that where the title comes from even? Yeah, he's the Lethal Weapon.
And that there's a scene in where he's sitting in his camper, like in the first act of the movie, with a gun in his mouth, looking at a picture of his wife, that is which could have been so over the top and so melodramatic and so maybe even corny, especially in a popcorn action movie.
Yeah.
And he single-handedly completely sells it and rips your heart out.
It's true.
It's an
a
incredible
very moving scene. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I would put in this category Deborah Winger in Officer and a Gentleman.
Okay.
She's an actor that is famously hard to work with, and I think that really impacted her opportunities as an actress as they moved out of the 80s. And I wonder how many young people even would know her name. But she was a huge star.
Yeah.
In the 80s, had started the decade with Urban Cowboy,
right,
which she's also great in.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And then
great.
Officer and a Gentleman, and had some big hits. She was offered Romancing the Stone. Yeah, she and she's just great. She just is one of those actors that is just magnetic on camera. You can't help but look at her, and that's a part, that movie, that is pretty rote on the page, and that she invests with a lot of pathos that is not necessarily there. Rebecca De Mornay in Risky Business. Again, it could have just been the hooker with the heart of gold, and instead she gives it a real interesting edge and also a real sadness.
Yeah,
you realize in certain scenes how young her character is,
right?
And what must have happened in her life to put her there, because she never tells us.
That's true.
We never get a backstory on where she came from.
Right, but she's showing it to you in some ways.
But it's all there, And her character also reveals itself very subtly to be much smarter than you might think she is at the beginning of the movie.
Which is very important to the movie also, And
then finally, I would put Tom Cruise in Rain Man, actually, speaking of Rain Man.
Interesting.
Just because it's one of those things that Harrison Ford does this a lot, which is, I think, sometimes these guys, their performances are undervalued, because I think it's really hard to carry a movie's narrative entirely on your shoulders. I mean, Dustin Hoffman does none of that work in Rain Man. That movie has, to the degree that movie has forward momentum and narrative structure, it's because of everything that Tom Cruise is doing in it. And I just think that's hard to do. I think it's not an 80s movie, but another movie I would cite in that same vein is The Fugitive.
Oh.
I don't think Ford was maybe he was nominated for an Oscar for that. But
I don't remember.
In fact, I don't think he was, because I think he's only been nominated for Witness. I think that was his only nomination.
Okay.
But he's so good in The Fugitive.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
It's it's wall-to-wall action, and yet in between the beats of action, he's doing this amazing stuff. Yeah. And then I had some other categories. I didn't know where to put them, so I'm just going to mention them.
Okay.
I think Melanie Griffith is incredible in Working Girl.
Oh, yeah.
So funny. She's great in Something Wild, too.
Oh, my gosh, yes. Yeah, definitely.
Charles Grodin in Midnight Run is such a dry character and so distinctive what he does with it. It's so funny.
Yeah.
Robert De Niro's work in The King of Comedy, the Scorsese movie, is one of the most skin-crawling portraits of desperation and sadness and anxiety that I've ever seen.
And at least in my experience, a very different Robert De Niro than I usually have seen.
Yeah.
Not a part I would have expected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whoopi Goldberg in Color Purple is really amazing. She's so young in that part, and it's her first film role. And so it's amazing what she does. Sissy Spacek and Cole Maynard's daughter playing Loretta Lynn.
Right.
Just the sort of the sweetness, the naivete that she has in that movie. It's really moving. Of course, you can't make a list like this without Meryl Streep in Sophie's Choice.
Sure.
I mean, she's the GOAT for a reason.
Yeah. There's a reason.
And I don't think I had her anywhere in my top 10, so I had to put her somewhere.
Sure.
Kenneth Branagh and Henry V.
Oh, yeah.
In his early 20s, like directing, writing. I mean, he's also just great
crazy.
in it. Shirley MacLaine in terms of endearment. That is a really sentimental movie, and she's giving a really unsentimental performance in it. Very like acidic taking it to the border of being unlikable, which is a pretty daring place to go in a movie that requires you to like her character.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And Hackman again, I'm going to mention for
You love
Mississippi
Hackman,
Burning.
Yeah.
Which is just pardon the pun if it's a pun, the kind of a barn burner of a performance. And he just he's like a wrecking ball through that movie. It's just watching. It's a really rewarding movie to watch. It's just 2 hours of Gene Hackman, kicking ass in that era of the South. Yeah, he's great in it. I made a category of supporting turns, parts where I felt like in some ways the supporting actor even kind of stole the movie, outshone the lead.
Yeah.
So again, like I would put Alan Rickman in this category.
I
mean, nothing against Bruce Willis.
No.
Die Hard changed his career, rightfully so. But Rickman steals that movie, let's be honest. Rutger Hauer in Blade Runner, I think is amazing. That last scene, the
Tears
in Rain.
Yeah.
Just that the way he plays that scene could have been really different. But
he's wonderful.
The tenor of his performance with that music from Vangelis and just the way it's shot by Ridley Scott is so amazing.
Yeah.
I think Jane Fonda in On Golden Pond, like of all the movies to like potentially disappear in as an actor. You're working opposite Henry Fonda and Katharine Hepburn.
Good Lord.
Both giving Oscar-winning performances.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when you hear the stories of like how tense that set was for Jane Fonda because of her own relationship with her dad and how mirrored it was with the relationship between the characters.
Yes.
And how fraught that film was for her on a personal level.
Sure.
She was also the producer. It's amazing how good she is in that movie. She's really good. John Gielgud in Arthur. Again, kind of like the Grodin performance. It's so dry.
So
but it also
dry.
has like, you can see his heart.
Yeah. Oh, he's wonderful. You certainly love him. Yeah.
It's a really lovely performance. Very deserving of the Oscar he won. Oscars don't often go to comedies, and
that is
cool
rare
to see that. Sean Penn in Fast Times at Ridgemont High,
Spicoli.
hilarious. Famously, like the story that you hear from Amy Heckerling is that he wasn't really playing it for laughs; that he was just so immersed in playing a stoner that it happened to come out funny.
Wow.
And man, he's funny.
He's very funny. I mean, is he one of those method guys? I've never been sure. I know, of course, that Daniel Day-Lewis is.
He might be. He might be.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. But I know
funny.
he's intense. He's very intense.
He does seem intense.
Very, very serious
in
about
life,
his work. Yeah. And then a couple of military movies. Defoe in Platoon.
Okay.
I mean, Willem Dafoe is always good.
Yes.
I think most of his best work was not in the 80s, although he was great in the stuff. I mean, he's great in Streets of Fire and what have you. But
a very different part, presumably. But
in Platoon, he plays the not pacifist, but the kind of the sensible platoon leader, the conscience of the movie in a way. And it's a heartbreaking performance.
I bet. I haven't seen it. So,
And then Arlie Ermy for Full Metal Jacket, who's almost playing himself because he was a former drill sergeant, but he's just, it's another example. Maybe I should have put it in that category with Eddie Murphy and Beverly Hills Cop. It's just another example of
perfectly
casting the right guy in the right part to catch lightning in a bottle.
Yes.
So, I don't know. Is anything I've said struck you so far before I leap into my top 10?
No, I mean, I'm loving everything I'm hearing. There's a lot I haven't seen. So, I'm as always, I'm building my list of, I really need to see some of these movies and some of these performances as well. Like Peggy Sue Got Married. I've never seen Platoon. I've never seen Coal Miner's Daughter, Mississippi Burning. I mean, there's just a lot on here. My Left Foot.
Yeah.
It's making me sound like I haven't seen any movies, but yeah, there's a lot on here I haven't seen that sounds worth seeing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
All right. Let's get into my top 10. Close with the top 10.
Yeah,
and
let's hear it.
I think some of these I'm really going to have to defend, but I'm going to do it.
Okay, well, please do. Go for it.
Because there's some outside the box choices here.
Well, that's what
and
we're
I was struck
about
by how
on this
many
show.
comedies I was putting in. And I think, again, performances in comedies are often really underappreciated. But if you talk to most actors, what you'll hear is that comedy is a lot tougher.
Yeah, I was going to say that earlier when you
drama.
were talking about Adam Sandler, the fact that my understanding is that comedy is like harder to do.
I think it's harder for everybody. It's
everybody.
harder to write. And it's hard because you have to produce a specific reaction from the audience that's demonstrable, right? Like if you write a comedy and nobody laughs, then you failed. If you write a drama, you're not going to hear anything from your audience. And so,
right.
It's like put up or shut up. And it's hard to direct because it's so timing based.
Yes, very timing based.
And there's a lot of opportunities in between writing it, shooting it, and editing it to mess up that timing.
Right.
You could, the timing could be right on the set and you could screw it up in the
editing, sure.
So, it's really tough.
It makes me wonder if and I don't know, I'm sure someone has written about this or talked about it. Is it easier to cross into drama as a chiefly comedic actor, or is it easier to go from drama to comedy? I would imagine it's easier to go from comedy to drama just because you're already doing the hard stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't really know.
I would guess. I don't
I don't know
for sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, certainly, I don't know. It seems like there's more examples of comedians who did good dramatic work than there are like really dead serious actors who all of a sudden tried to do a comedy.
That's how it seems.
It completely blew up in their face.
Anecdotally, that's how it seems.
Yeah, it does seem that way.
Yep.
So anyway, all right, getting into the top 10. My number 10 is Jodie Foster for The Accused, and this is, I think, the only one in my top 10 that won an Oscar. She won Best. This is her first Best Actress award. She won a couple years later for Silence of the Lambs.
I haven't seen this movie, so I don't know this performance.
I don't know if you could take it.
It might not be for me, but
it's really intense. I mean, she plays a victim of a vicious gang rape.
Oh gosh. Okay, I see why I haven't seen it.
Yeah, and the movie is about her putting the guys who cheered the rape on from the sidelines on trial as being implicit in the complicit in the act.
Right.
And based on a true story. I mean, a fictionalized version of a true story, but she's so raw in it. And it's a hard movie to watch and it's a hard performance to watch. But she's just incredible. And I think it's her best work as an actor.
Wow.
Yeah. Switching, going
hard turn
really
here.
hard turn, number 9. And I think people will be like, what? When I say this,
Maybe not.
Let me defend it.
Yes, please.
This is a portrait of a completely 100% fully formed person. And it's a person that it's a slightly, maybe tremendously exaggerated version of a person that a lot of us know.
Yes.
Right?
Or have been.
Or have even been, which is, it's Chevy Chase in Vacation.
Yes.
So Chase is playing Clark Griswold,
Yep.
who is the ultimate kind of like well-meaning but somewhat doddering,
Hapless.
foolish, hapless dad.
Yeah.
Right? And his instincts as a comedian are so good that, I mean, I think it's a lot is often overlooked with him because he's famously hard to work with and not the nicest guy in the world. And there's not a lot of inclination among people in the industry or the press to say nice things about him. And that's fair enough.
Yeah.
But I can tell you, like, I watched the remake of Vacation and he's not in it until the very end. And as soon as he's in it, like, he's really given nothing to do. But there's a scene where he has to get up and like get some dishes out of a cabinet or something.
Right.
And it turns into a master class in physical comedy.
Yeah.
He can't, and you know, he can't not be, his instincts are just so good.
Yeah.
They're so good.
And they're constant.
I think that they were, I mean, I love Fletch.
Yes.
But I think he was given his best opportunity to do a fully formed character who's different from himself. Like Chevy Chase often seemed to be, he always wanted to seem in on the joke and like be cool.
Right.
Like Fletch was a cool guy.
Yes.
He was the smartest guy in the room.
Always. Right. Yeah.
Chevy Chase was a cool guy on SNL.
Right. I see.
But like in Vacation, he's the dum-dum.
He's clueless a lot of the time. Yeah. Yeah.
And he also gives Clark a dark, there's an element of like the real a-hole in Clark, right? And you especially see it in Christmas Vacation.
Yes. He's
like,
has some lows.
but he's got some nasty edges to him for sure.
Yeah.
But I just think it's such a funny portrait of a Midwestern dad. I mean, he just nails it.
Or of a lot of dads. I mean, a dad on vacation is a thing, I think.
Driven to insanity.
Yeah.
And again, like the script is great. The script by John Hughes is legendary. Yeah. But if you went scene by scene carefully, and I've seen this movie so many times I could recite it, so I've actually kind of done this, and look at what he's doing versus what's on the page, so much of it is all Chevy Chase.
That physical comedy thing.
Yeah. It's the way he's turning a line of dialogue or something he does with his body or a facial expression or what have you. So, yeah. Number 8, another SNL alum.
Yeah.
Bill Murray in Scrooged. And I think like a lot of people were surprised by Bill Murray in Lost in Translation. Yeah. They were like, oh, Bill Murray's a good actor all of a sudden. Yeah. And I just feel like if you go back to Scrooged especially, that's the one where you can really see that this guy can play a deep, incredible sadness and melancholy.
He's got range. Yeah. Agreed.
And like the scene where the Ghost of Christmas Past scene where David Johansen takes him to see his mother, and you see how bad his childhood was, but how much his mother loved him still. And the way Murray plays that scene is really moving. And then the ending of that movie, the last 15 minutes are essentially a nonstop monologue where Murray has this complete.
Oh yeah.
It's the Christmas morning scene.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
But he does it, and he's a TV executive, and he does it on the set of the Christmas Carol.
This live Christmas spectacular.
This live Christmas Carol. Yeah. And he kind of takes over, and he just kind of freestyles, and it really feels like he's off book, and maybe for part of it he was.
He's a very good improver, from what I understand.
It doesn't seem scripted.
Right.
And it's just so, you really just see him figuring it out as he says it, and just having a breakdown in a way that is full of elation instead of the kind of breakdown that actors usually get to play, which is
end of their rope.
Yeah. Instead, it's like he's playing euphoric revelation
I'm alive,
as
hooray.
A breakdown.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, really hard to do, and he really nails it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things that fascinates me about good actors is, and so this may have all been improv for him. I don't know, but the fact that actors can make something seem like it's just occurring to them, even though if it, it wasn't the script or they've done it a million times or whatever. I think that's amazing. It's
he has
an amazing
this whole
skill.
bit at the end, where he's talking about like, he's like, why can't we feel like this the whole year round? Like, why do we only feel like this on
at Christmas?
Why are people only nice to each other on Christmas? Like, if we can do it on Christmas, why can't you do it other days?
Right.
And it's just tears my heart out every time I see it.
It's definitely a weeper.
Yeah. My number 7 is Christopher Walken in The Dead Zone.
Oh, yeah.
David Cronenberg's adaptation of the Stephen King bestseller. And Walken is such a strange performer because he's so mannered. Like, everybody can do an impression of him, right?
Yeah.
That's the Dead Zone is the movie where I remember, that and Deer Hunter, where I think like, oh, right, he's also a really, really good actor.
Sometimes you need a reminder with some of these folks. Yeah.
He's not doing like Walken bits.
No, not
in that
at all.
movie.
Yeah.
And I think part of this, of course, is Cronenberg. I mean, with all of these, like the performances by actors are not created in a vacuum. They're created in collaboration with, usually with a director.
And their fellow performers. Yeah, of course.
And the editor who has to put it together.
Yeah.
And, it's a collaborative. It's a collaborative field.
Collaborative,
so I won't say this is all Christopher Walken's idea, but the thing about that movie is it's a horror film and it is scary. It's got some scary moments, but it's so profoundly sad.
Yeah,
that movie.
bleak.
And it for me, like, that all comes from his performance. And the thing that feels the thing that happens in that movie is that he's in an accident and he's in a coma. And when he comes out of the coma some years later, the love of his life has married somebody else and has a family.
It's like a decade later or something.
And he has this like skill now that he can see how people die when he touches them. And those two things make for a pretty horrible life.
Yeah.
And I think that if the movie had just been about trying to scare you with his visions, then it still would have been good, but it would have just been a good, scary movie. What gives it weight and sadness is how he, as an actor, instead of just says, I'm gonna be in here as a function of the plot, he says, I'm gonna play what would this feel like? And what it would feel like is flipping horrible.
Yeah.
Like in a blink of because all he knows is he went to sleep, and when he woke up, his fiance had a husband and kids.
Yeah, right. His life
was over.
Gone. Yeah.
It's a really weirdly sad horror movie.
Yeah. Well, that's also Stephen King for you, right? I mean, I think he likes to scare us with the humanity of things sometimes more so than the metaphysical.
Yeah. All right, my number 6 is John Candy in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles.
Yeah.
This should maybe be higher. It's just that there's so many good performances in this decade. I think this is one of the best performances of all time.
Yeah.
It tells you what I think about the stuff that's coming. Oh, my God. On top of just being one of the funniest performances in any movie ever, it's just such a... It's kind of like I feel about it the same way I kind of feel about Chevy Chase in Vacation. It could have been just bits, and like he could play the comedy of this character in his sleep.
Sure.
And instead, what he does is almost miraculous. He it's so warm. He injects it with so much humanity that that movie to me, as funny as it is, I tend to think of as a tearjerker first. Yeah. And it's all because of what he's doing as an actor.
Well, it's another one of those performances where there is a little bit of sadness and you sort of slowly start to realize it.
So in that, in that last scene, hopefully everybody's seen it. If you haven't, put your fingers in your ears. But his character has lost his wife and you don't realize that until the end.
Yeah.
And he comes home with Steve Martin and he's in the foyer and he watches Steve Martin embrace his wife and you see him look down and he like tugs at his hat and then he looks up and smiles and the film freeze frames on that smile. And it's just like,
oh gosh,
It's the most emotional ending for me of any movie.
Yeah. I'm getting a little choked up just thinking about it. Yeah.
I'm having a hard time describing it.
Yeah.
So let's move on.
Okay.
Number 5. So number 5, I have a 3-way tie.
Oh,
because
wow.
I was thinking first, my first thought was Ray Liotta here in Something Wild.
Oh my gosh.
But then I had this other thought, which was like, I was thinking like what I loved about Ray Liotta in Something Wild. And it's not just his charisma, which he has a ton of, and that it's also kind of a darkly funny performance, but that he feels so genuinely unhinged
and dangerous
so dangerous
in
that movie that it doesn't feel like an actor giving a performance. No. It feels like it's the kind of thing where like if I was on the set with him, I would be like, I don't know if I want to, how close I want to get to this guy. Because anybody who could play this part that well has to actually maybe on some level be a psychopath.
I mean, I think we're back to that believability plus compellingness, cocktail. He's got it in spades in this movie for sure.
He's so frightening in that movie.
He's very frightening.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
And so I thought what occurred to me when I started thinking about why I picked that performance, it made me think of 2 other performances that kind of do the same thing.
Yeah.
Maybe not quite as successfully as Liotta, but close. And those are Morgan Freeman in Street Smart, which is a little scene thriller that should have a bigger audience.
Yes, this one I haven't seen.
Where he plays a pimp named Fast Black, who Christopher Reeve is a journalist who's writing a story about him, and man, does he seem like an actual scary.
He seems really scary, believably frightening. Yeah.
It feels like a performance that's on the verge of being out of control.
Oh boy. Wow. Yeah.
And so, he's another actor that I feel like he's one of those actors that has been doing the same thing for so long that it's easy to forget, especially when he was younger, how good he was.
Yeah. Be refreshed by some of these older performances. Yeah.
And then the other one would be Glenn Close in Fatal Attraction.
Oh, yeah.
I won't be ignored, Dan. I mean, it is like, it doesn't seem, I remember the first time I saw that movie, I was a little kid. And then I remember seeing her at the Academy Awards and she was pregnant.
Oh,
And I remember thinking, and she seemed so sweet.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh.
She's probably a very nice lady.
Weird.
Yeah. Right, acting.
She seemed like a normal person. I was just so
surprised
her
by
performance in that movie is so intense.
Yeah.
That, I mean, it's why, I think it's because she's so good that they had to change the ending of that movie, right? Like the ending of that movie was initially that she kills herself and frames him essentially, and he goes to prison. And the audience hated that ending because they wanted to see her get it.
Because she was that,
but the thing is, like,
compelling.
Her character's not wrong. In that movie, she's nuts, and the things she does are completely
unhinged,
wrong and criminal.
Right,
but she's completely justified in feeling the way she does.
Of course,
And so, does she deserve the comeuppance she gets? I don't know, but I will tell you that her performance is so scary and so intense that you
she seems
can't
so dangerous.
Help but root for her to get it bad.
Well, she seems dangerous, right?
Yeah.
You want that danger to go away or whatever, and you're at your most basic level. Yeah.
So my number 4 is another movie or another performance I think that transcends its genre, which is Sigourney Weaver in Aliens.
Oh, so good.
And granted, the Walter Hill, Cameron, whoever else worked on that script, wrote her a great part. But so much of it is what she does with it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like Ford in The Fugitive, right? It's a pretty straightforward action movie. On top of that, it's like a military action movie. It's like a war movie.
It's a hardcore sci-fi movie.
Yeah.
I mean,
and so
all of those
there's
things.
just she's not afforded a lot of room to do what an actor in a drama maybe would
There's
do.
not a lot of
there's not a lot of real estate there for her to work with, and so it's amazing what she's able to do with the scenes she has to express real empathy, especially for the little girl, for Newt.
Yeah.
and I just find it really moving. And I just some of her line readings, I just love so much. Like when the scene where they're briefing the Marines before they go down.
Oh, yeah.
And the Marines are kind of giving her some lip, like
and they're treating it
Vasquez
very
is like,
lightly.
I just need to know one thing, where they are. And she's like, I hope you're right, because that thing managed to wipe out my entire crew in less than 24 hours. And she just goes off, and she's just so great. But mostly it's the
great.
really tender stuff, the really tender scenes that she has with Newt that are just so beautiful and so moving at the center of this movie. And I think are really like, without those scenes, you don't care as much about all of the action that surrounds them.
It gives it some real stakes, even more stakes.
She puts a heart in the middle of in the middle of a military action movie, which is quite incredible.
Not easy to do.
She was nominated. That's one of the fewer. I mean, for as little often as comedies get nominated for Oscars, like action movie performances never
action
get
movie.
nominated.
Yeah.
So that was incredible. She should have won.
Yeah.
My number 3 is Paul Newman in The Verdict.
Okay.
I don't think you've seen this.
No,
right?
I don't know this one. I haven't seen it. I mean, I've heard you talk about it.
It's Sidney Lumet. I think it's Boston. I think it's the greatest courtroom thriller of all time.
Wow, that's really saying something. There's been many of those.
And Newman's always good. He always transcends these movies like Slapshot. He shouldn't have been as good as he was. He's great in that.
He's Paul Newman, right?
He's Paul Newman, yeah. And a lot of it's like, but it's not, in this movie, he's not gliding on his movie star charisma. Mm-hmm. He's playing a really broken, sad, disgraced, alcoholic attorney who gets this case that is going to provide him with the opportunity to redeem himself in his own eyes. Mm-hmm. And that's what's at stake. Yeah. And you really, without any of that ever being said, you get it entirely through how desperate his performance is. Mm-hmm. And especially coming at that point in his career, it's a pretty brave and bold piece of work on his part. And there's, on top of it, this like long 6-minute shot at the end, unbroken with no edits, of him delivering his closing remarks. Oh man, what a gift to an actor, I suppose. Exactly. They'd love that. Yeah, he's great. It's another performance that should have won the Oscar.
I'm surprised. I guess I thought that was going to be the one that won the Oscar out of your top 10, but no. Okay.
My number 2 is our girl Kathleen in Romancing the Stone, which of course is my favorite movie. And it's another, much like Sigourney Weaver, putting heart, and I think Kathleen does the same thing. Yeah, it's a genre jumping movie. One of the
action,
earlier
ones.
Mm-hmm. It's comedy. Romance. It's slapstick. It's verbal, like It Happened One Night style comedy. Yeah, it's got drama.
It's romance.
It's romance. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it takes Douglas in that movie, he's great at what he does, and it's a funnier performance than you would expect to get from the leading man. Yep. But the weight of that movie is all on her in terms of the character arc.
She has to carry it. Yeah.
Yeah. She's a mouse at the beginning of that movie, and at the end, she's like a fully formed person. Yeah, who has confidence?
She's let her hair down. Her shoulders are thrown back. She is, yeah,
and yet it's a movie full of people going over waterfalls and hacking through the jungle and swinging over canyons. And in the middle of all that, somehow, and it's paced really fast. Mm-hmm. In the middle of all that, somehow she finds a way, just through her performance, to give you a character arc that you can track from scene to scene. Like you can literally, it's very subtle, but you can see it from scene to scene. You can see her character getting incrementally more confident and sure of herself. Yeah.
Fascinating.
And it's just a beautiful thing. She talks about, in our book, she talked about using the wardrobe to track that performance, that she would show up to work because they shoot out of sequence. Yeah. So when you have a character that has a huge character arc like that one does, one of the challenges for you as a film actor is keeping track of where in that character arc you are on a given day, since you might be shooting the ending on one day, the beginning on the next day, and something from the middle of the movie on the third day.
Yeah.
And she would talk about getting her wardrobe in every morning and seeing how destroyed it was,
right,
and using that as a visual cue to tell her where to pitch her performance for that day. Because her wardrobe deteriorates over the course of the movie. So the worse her wardrobe gets, the kind of more sure of herself she gets in the movie. And I thought that was kind of a fascinating
it's amazing
hack
stuff
that she came up with.
Absolutely. I was surprised this wasn't your number one, so I'm excited to hear what your number one is.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it should have been, just because it is my favorite performance, but I was trying to make this list of the best performances.
It was a little more objective. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I thought there was maybe potentially one better. But of course, this is all of this stuff is super subjective.
Of course.
Is Bill Murray and Scrooge
opinion
better than Chevy Chase and Vicky? I don't know.
It's okay. We're just talking.
But I know that I love Michael Keaton in a movie called Clean and Sober.
Okay.
Which is a drama with the kind of pitch of a thriller. It feels like a thriller, but it's a drama just about a guy who is an addict.
Yeah.
And the struggles he faces to get clean. And
I guess that could be a thriller. I could see that. Yeah. Wow.
It's got an amazing supporting cast of character actors. Morgan Freeman runs the clinic that he goes to. He's great in it.
Okay.
Kathy Baker is his fellow patient. Tate Donovan is in the clinic with him. Emmett Walsh, the legendary character actor. Emmett Walsh plays his sponsor once he gets out.
Oh, yeah. Great.
And it just feels like this amazing kind of live wire performance. And it's... Keaton is often, I love Keaton, but he's often a very showy actor, right? He's big. Whether he's doing Batman or Mr. Mom or what have you.
Yeah, that's true.
And
he's got those eyebrows.
He always
and he
looks
uses
like
them.
Michael Keaton.
Yeah.
And he's really intense.
Yeah.
And,
it's true.
You want to get nuts? Let's get nuts. He's breaking things. That's Michael Keaton in my mind. Or he's like Mr. Mom. And
certainly of the 80s, that's for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
And in this movie, he completely disappears in this part, and you completely forget that you're watching Michael Keaton. And yet at the same time, it's also a star performance because he's so charismatic. It just feels like a performance where a guy is doing 8 things at the same time, and he's doing them all really well. He's plate spinning like you wouldn't believe. And it's a great movie. It's a hugely underrated movie that not enough people have seen. And so if you haven't seen Clean and Sober, here's your recommendation that you should go check out Michael Keaton in Clean and Sober, because he's just phenomenal and heartbreaking and moving, and and intense and fun, and there's humor and it's got an edge, and he's just doing a lot, and it's all working. So
awesome.
Yeah, that's my top 10.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for talking to us about, acting and performers today. This was, I think we all probably now have a list of things we need to go watch and things to think about as we watch the next movie we watch. And yeah, it's great. It's always really fun to peek behind the curtain a little bit and
it's the
think
kind of thing
harder
that rewards people who are into movies to the level that they want repeat viewings.
Right.
Because it's not a thing you should ever be thinking about the first time you're watching a movie is like, man, this actor is doing such great work. If you're doing that, then the actor maybe isn't doing such great work.
Yes.
Or what that means is that the film is letting the actor down, right?
Right. It could be
because the movie surrounding the actor doing the great work is not good enough to support that work.
Right. That's true.
Hopefully, like if you're watching Clean and Sober and you're thinking about how good Michael Keaton is doing, instead of like just being utterly enthralled by this poor guy's like heroic fight to clean himself up.
Yeah.
Then, you're not seeing the movie in the right way. But if you're a film fan and you've seen that movie 20 times like I have,
you start to notice.
you start to look, you start to see the riches in what he's doing as an artist, for sure.
Cool. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. We'll catch you in the next episode.
All right. See you soon. You've been listening to The Long Rewind. The program is produced by Dustin Morrow and hosted by me, Lisa Molinelli. If you enjoy the show, please consider hitting the subscribe button, leave us a good review on your podcast app, and tell your friends about the program. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.